Heather Jones is here with me now. She's a specialist in World War I studies. Heather, how did they get it so wrong, thinking they'd be away for a few weeks and back in time for Christmas?
I think there was what was called a short war illusion in 1914. There was a sense that previous wars had been colonial wars, they'd been over very quickly, and there was a belief that Europe couldn't sustain a long economic war. Writers such as Ivan Bloch had suggested that the economies would all collapse, bringing a war to an end, so that long war was impossible because the continent was so interrelated and globalization had happened and economies across the world were so intertwined.
We just heard about Paul's great-grandfather being 67, wanting to go to war, but more typically was relatives who are much too young. My own great-grandfather was 14 when he was dispatched to war. Why were they so keen to get involved?
Well, I think young teenage boys were part of the atmosphere of the time, particularly in August and September 1914, where there's reports of the British Army, the British Expeditionary Force, being crushed at the Battle of Mons, the need for volunteers, Kitchener's call for volunteers. Young teenagers want to act as adults. They want to be like the adult men, yes, the adventure that they see around them. So they joined up to try and prove their adulthood in a way. And there was many a blind eye turned to that in 1914 because of this belief that the war would be over soon.
But that wore off pretty quickly, I'd imagine, when the reality became apparent.
It did indeed, and once the carnage became apparent, in fact, Britain has to turn to a conscription system, and a conscription system that is implemented much more strictly than some of the volunteering processes that had been in existence in 1914. Conscription is very much about men who are over 18, and it's introduced with many regulations to make sure that men who are underage actually don't go to the front.
Obviously, an awful lot of negative things resonated after the war ended in 1918, not least, I guess, the groundwork for another great war in the Second World War. What positives, if any, came out of the end of the war?
That's a very good question. And obviously the cost of the war wasn't worth the positives that did come out, and one has to immediately state that the human carnage was terrible, and many of the things that came out of the war were trends that had been present before it, such as female suffrage. That would probably have come about without the First World War anyway. It's accelerated by the war. Extending the franchise to many working class men in Britain who didn't have the vote before the war also probably would have come about without the war. However, more radical things such as the collapse of 4 major empires across Europe, the Russian Revolution, they wouldn't have happened without the First World War, and some of them really kick-started social reforms within the victorious states at the end of the First World War, and to some extent in Weimar Germany, where countries felt the state now had to actually act to improve living standards for working class and peasantry, and that was an important thing that the state should do. That idea hadn't really been there so much before 1914.
Heather, thanks. Many things that we're still feeling the effects of now. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.